Hello and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast about anything and everything to do with the Beatles as a group, as solo artists, past, present, future, if we can figure out what that's going to be. I'm Alan Kozin, the author of The Beatles From the Cavern to the Rooftop and Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Wanna Hold Your Hand Changed Everything. And I'm joined by my two regular co-hosts, Ken Michaels, who you know as the host of the syndicated radio show Every Little Thing. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Alan. Hi, everybody.
And Steve Marinucci, who writes about Beatles news for Axis.com, Billboard.com, Variety, Goldmine, all kinds of places, all kinds of new places being added almost weekly. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Alan. Hello, everyone.
Okay, and today we have a special guest, Walter Everett, the author of a stack of books about the Beatles and related subjects, and we will introduce him directly in a couple of minutes, but first we have some news, and Steve, I'll hand that over to you.
Okay. Well, this past week, Concert for George it came back in the theaters for a day, and it also, well, they had the big re-release for George's birthday. A visitor to my Facebook page was marveling about the sound. I did not see it myself, but he said that the new sound was much better than previous. There was also a new George Harrison comic book released by Tidal Wave Comic Books. It's one of those bio comic books, and it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and everywhere else you can get it. It's put out again.
I think they prefer to call them graphic novels now. I guess it's not really a novel, okay. Graphic bio.
Well, it says, I'm looking at the website, and it says bio comic book, so that's what it said. That's what they're calling it. But yeah, I think a graphic novel is probably a better terminology for it. The Ruddles announced a UK tour. You all heard Neil Innes here last week in a very marvelous interview, and they announced a UK tour. They're also touring the US, but this is a little more extensive in the UK. And then did I mention the Weaklings single? The Weaklings put out a new single called "In the Moment," which is a song they've been performing. They don't have an album coming out yet. They will eventually, but the new single is out digitally. It comes out on March 2nd digitally, and it is on YouTube. In the Moment, the video for that. Mm-hmm. So,
could I add something?
Sure.
I wanted to add something about the Concert for George because Steve, you said that it's running for one day, and if you actually go to the concert's website, concertforgeorge.com, they have a link there for theatrical listings. And it is true that most of the theaters are running it for a day, but they're not all running it on George's birthday. There are some that are actually running it in March, so you might want to check that out. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of theaters in the United States in particular that are running it in March, and some are running it for more than a day. So
okay.
All right, then. And that's it for news? Sort of a slow news week, seemingly.
Yeah.
Which is...
This is Walt. Can I ask a question? There was mention in the run-up to the show here that a new photograph from George had just appeared, a photograph from him in 1965.
Well, I don't know if it's new, Walter, but a friend of mine posted a picture on his Facebook page of this shot of George, young-looking shot of George, and he said it was from 65, and and a couple of us who know him, he's a former colleague of mine. I told him that I hadn't seen the picture before, and somebody else that worked with he and I said the same thing, and she was also a Beatle fan. And so I posted it on my Facebook page, my Beatles Facebook page, and everybody was really amazed that they hadn't seen this picture before.
How long ago did you post it, Steve? I'll have
last night. I posted it last night.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still there.
It's just great how photographs you'd never seen before just come up. And, hearing that reminded me of, I think my all-time favorite Beatle photograph is of George Harrison. It's in the book that Olivia put together with Scorsese, combination with a Scorsese film. And there's this picture of George in his Beatles suit on the observation deck of the Empire State Building.
Mm-hmm.
The picture was taken, and he's holding a camera. He's a tourist, right? The picture was taken in his visit to the States. Was it August or September '63, before the Beatles arrived?
I remember that.
Yeah, and he's just walking along in the observation deck among all kinds of other people who have no idea who he is. And there he is, Beatle haircut and the Beatle suit. It's just a beautiful photograph. So, a new photograph of George is a very welcome thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So
there was one other thing.
Go ahead.
There was one other thing about George, and that's that over the past weekend, they were playing his music at Starbucks coffee houses. And I know that you posted something about that, Steve, on Facebook, because the music, from what I understand, was curated by Danny.
Right.
He had his own playlist. So that was a pretty cool thing to do. It's kind of interesting when you think about it. And I've been wondering, the concert for George coming out through Concord Music, why it wasn't through Universal. And, Paul used to be on Concord Music, and then when he signed, they had a special deal going on with Starbucks then. So it's kind of interesting that the two of them, it's kind of similar what went on with their releases.
Well, and not to drag this on too long, but it was funny that people were saying that that the Blu-ray had gone out of print. I mean, I got one. I bought one a year or two ago, and I'm glad I did, because apparently at that point they hadn't gone out of print yet. So I mean, it's weird that it went out of print to begin with. That was kind of weird, but anyway.
Okay, so let me introduce Walter formally, even though you've heard him for a couple of seconds here. He is a professor of music at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance since 1989. The books that are particularly relevant to us here are, well, there's 2 volumes of the Beatles as musicians. Volume 1 is The Quarrymen Through Rubber Soul. Volume 2 is Revolver Through the Anthology. And there's a 3rd book that's you should, basically all look at if you care about this stuff, even though it's not specifically to do with the Beatles. It's called The Foundations of Rock, From Blue Suede Shoes to Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. And they are all published by Oxford University Press. And the Beatles books, the 2 Beatles books, take a very detailed analytical look at the Beatles' music from the point of view of a trained musician who understands how chords function as opposed to just what they are, and all of the other analytical sort of apparatus that typically, until moderately recently, was really just applied mainly to classical music. And there's been a few attempts to bring that approach to the Beatles, starting, I guess, with Wilfrid Mellors back in the late 60s, early 70s. He had a book called Twilight of the Gods. And I got that when it came out, and my feeling was that, Wilfrid Mellors' heart was in the right place, and his analytical stuff was in the right place. He just didn't seem to really understand what the Beatles' music was actually about. I don't know. Tim Riley did one, and Terence O'Grady, but Walter's books are by far the most thorough. And apart from being the most thorough, I mean, you look at his sources and you look at the stuff he mentions, and I mean, none of the others, I think, would have taken a passing interview in Beatles Monthly magazine and used it as evidence of what might have gone on in the recording of a track. So, you read these books and you know that on one hand we're talking about, serious musicologist and analyst, and on the other hand he's like one of us. So, I mean, all the bootlegs are referred to, everything, So Walter,
yeah.
Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. Your appreciation of the books is really fine. And thank you to Ken and Alan too for having me. It's really a pleasure talking to you guys. And oh yeah, I am one of you guys. And I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in 1964, and even though I'd had 3 years of piano lessons by that time, that was the event that made me decide I was going to be a musician, and so I bought bootlegs as soon as I saw them. My eyes came out of my head when I saw that Wilfred Mellers book around 1976, and it's been a great ride ever since.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the logical question is to ask, why is it important to analyze and explain the Beatles in terms that you would normally apply to classical music? I mean, given that they're self-trained musicians, don't read music, and that everything we're hearing is intuitive in a way, I guess.
That's right. It is extremely intuitive. Aeolian cadences are about the mildest sort of relationship I talk about, and that's something obviously John Lennon thought was a reference to exotic birds. So it's true that many musicians, even those who are highly trained composers and performers, may not be aware of what they're doing. It's all the best music is intuitive. A highly trained person may come about things more easily, but you can't say Paul McCartney isn't trained just because he can't read music or doesn't understand the terminology. Obviously, he has size 10 ears, and ever since he was listening to his dad play on the family piano, he's been soaking it in, and everything he hears goes right into his music. And I'm sure he couldn't read one of the denser paragraphs of my books and said, "Oh yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking." No, that's not what I'd expect to hear from him. But the kinds of things I draw out are an explanation for why the things work, and not everybody will be interested in that. But I really wrote those books were my tenure project. Where you have to prove to the people at the top of the field that you've got the chops and you're not a poser. So I really wrote the books for about 8 people who'd be writing letters for my tenure file.
I see.
But it's changed my career really to see the reception the books got from the general public, people who don't know how to read music, who maybe play guitar, maybe just like to listen to Beatles music. And, so many emails saying, well, there's so many great insights here. Your appreciation of the guitars and what went on in the control room and what inspired the Beatles, and your interpretations are neat. I just skip all the parts I don't understand. And so, that's what made me try to reach the general public as really the central readership for the Foundations of Rock. Although it too is, coming from an academic, you can't mistake that. I think it's much more readable by the general public than some of the more technical things in the Beatles books.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't get a note from Paul McCartney saying, "Yes, I did mean to go to the submediant there,"
No, but there's wonderful. He talks about musical relationships in a very subtle way. He did an interview with Terry Gross maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and he was talking about when Terry asked him, "When did you know that you were really doing something original?" And McCartney said, when we were writing From Me to You, and we went into the bridge, he said, the song is in C major, and normally you'd have a G major chord, but we use a G minor chord. And it was like going into another world. Mm-hmm. And it was. I mean, what happens is we actually go a little bit from C major to F major at that point, which often happens at the beginning of a bridge. And his saying it's like going to another world. It's like leaving the home key behind and going to a new key, which he may not have appreciated, but he certainly understood the effect that he was at.
Yeah. So, in other words, for people who just like listening to the records, they get to that bridge and it sounds like not what they expected, and it's really ear-catching, and your job basically is to say why.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then the cool thing is saying, oh, they did exactly the same thing, I want to hold your hand, you know, and to see all the, you know, career-spanning tricks that you can't say the Beatles composed by formula because every song is different, but there are little tricks that keep coming back, sometimes years apart, and then you say, oh yeah, that's McCartney remembering how he did this in 8 days a week or whatever. Yeah.
Have you ever wondered if they secretly could read music? I mean, because you know, McCartney talks about golden slumbers and, you know, reading his, you know, paging through his, I guess, stepsister's piano book, and he's saying, well, I was just reading the words and, you know, just playing melodies to go with the words. But I kind of wonder, and also, I don't know, when I was in London to do interviews for the anthology, there was this meeting that George walked into, and what did he have in his hand? He had a stack of blank manuscript paper. And why would he need blank manuscript paper?
That's right. Well, you know, George did study music theory, actually, but for his Northern Indian music. I mean, he would... You may have seen the films of him from Summer in California. It might have been 1967. And he's working on his sitar and he's saying the syllables. So you could hear him coaching the group for Within You, Without You in the Deluxe Pepper set. Has any of you heard that? It's a rehearsal session for Within You, Without You. And George is teaching the parts by ear, but he's singing the syllables, gamma, pani, that, you know, he learned in Indian. So, you know, he probably didn't need manuscript paper to do that, but the gamma, pani is the Indian equivalent to, you know, writing the note names in notation. And McCartney probably would have been the closest to have use for reading and writing music. And he could really have done quite a bit that way with arranging for, you know, orchestral instruments, say. It was during the Liverpool Oratorio, or was it during the Standing Stone project that he says he made an effort at learning to read music, but it just it was too much effort for him. It got in the way of his normal way of thinking. So
he also had a sort of irrational fear of, if he learned music formally, that he might subconsciously plagiarize or something, which two of his pals have been taken to court for. But the example he uses is that Leonard Bernstein Somewhere is like the slow movement of the Beethoven, I think, second piano concerto. But like, that's deliberate. That's not a mistake. That's sort of an homage.
That's a funny thing. I mean, McCartney is more likely to plagiarize just from having heard something and it's knocking around in his head. I mean, look how he worried for years before deciding that he really had written Yesterday. It wasn't anything he ever would have seen. And I would guess that if you see a score in manuscript, you're more likely to remember it as something you've seen, and you would have both the oral and the visual connection with it. You'd be more likely to remember that it's not yours. Yeah.
So I should at this point pass you to Ken. We go around and everyone asks questions. So Ken?
Okay. I just wanted to add to what you just were talking about with Paul and not wanting to learn properly, like music theory. I think that there's a fear in him that if you're taught this is the proper way, these are the chords that go in this key, that he's likely to think he can't stray from that instead of doing what might sound more natural or what he's feeling, in his head or in his mind.
Right.
Which,
well, there is an anxiety there for sure, but there's also, McCartney wanting to make sure that he's using his own voice as widely varied as the styles and different ways he has of communicating in music. He wants to have his own voice. So, for instance, in writing Yesterday, remember he wanted to give the cello that E flat, and George Martin said, "Oh no, Bach would never have written that." And McCartney says, "Oh well, then we've got to do it then." And from that point on, when there were references to Bach, whether obscure or direct, the so-called harpsichord solo, the wind-up piano solo in My Life, or the piccolo trumpet in Penny Lane, or Blackbird having been based on McCartney's hearing of a Bach piece. If you listen, all of those Beatles songs have that same flat seventh in it. It's like McCartney's fingerprint. He's like, well, if we're going to say this is Bach, we've missed the point. This is McCartney. And not that he wrote the In My Life solo, but definitely in Penny Lane and Blackbird, I hear him go for that bluesy lower 7th scale degree, despite the fact that Bach wouldn't have used it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he doesn't let, there's an anxiety, I think, about being compared with the classical set, but he's got, he's very strong in his ways to get around that.
Okay, could you possibly talk about the odd chord progressions in Beatles songs? Because, and in a way that people who don't really study music can understand this, because I do have a musical background and I do recognize certain things that are unusual in songs. I'm more intrigued by what preceded the Beatles and what did the Beatles do first or were amongst the first to do, and were they influenced by the artists around them. But when it comes to chord progressions, I know that in the case of I Want to Hold Your Hand, like the first 4 chords, where it goes is unusual, because the last chord where the Beatles are singing, I think you'll understand, it's in the key of G. And it goes from a G to a D to an E minor and then to a B major, which is very unusual. And so something like that, if you can explain to our listeners why that is different.
Right. Well, the B chord in G major is something the Beatles had done in She Loves You. And they had a way of mixing chords that were totally within the scale and those that are totally outside the scale. And at first it would be using, these are chords we call chromatic chords that borrow from pitches outside the major scale. Mm-hmm. They're used a lot in particular ways. It's just that the Beatles would find new ways to use them, so they would not go to the chords you expect them to. So that the 3 chord, the mediant chord in She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, was part of their 1963 sound. Another chord from She Loves You is the major chord on the 2nd scale degree, which normally is minor. And that when you get a major chord on the 2nd scale degree, it usually goes to the chord built on the 5th scale degree. It's a way of strengthening what we call the 5 chord built on the 5th scale degree. But instead, the Beatles move in an unexpected way from the major chord on 2 to a 4 chord. Mm-hmm. And not only is it a 4 chord in She Loves You, but it's a minor 4 chord. So they go to a C minor chord from an A7 chord, in other words. Very unusual set of relationships. Almost unprecedented, except the fact that they stole it from a Bobby Rydell song called Forget Him that was on the radio in England at the time. Yeah.
That's a great song, by the way.
Check out Forget Him, because McCartney only remembered it being a Bobby Rydell song, but if you look at the charts, that's the song they were talking about. And sure enough, it has that same relationship. And that, in fact, that's the I call that the Lydian 2. It's just because it uses that major chord on the second scale degree in a way that would have been done in the Lydian mode that goes back hundreds of years, but not in tonal music. And so that's a chord that is used in 8 Days a Week and She's Leaving Home and many, many other Beatles songs. Another example is, the Hard Day's Night chord, which in a song in G major, if you have a D in the bass, it's going to sound like a 5 chord. And McCartney is playing a D. George Martin is playing Ds on the piano in the low register of the piano. But up above that, you hear an F major chord and a G on top. Pitches that don't have anything to do with the major chord on D that you would expect at the beginning of a song in G major. So that Hard Day's Night chord, is brilliant. But the Beatles find a way to slip that into I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, and it's there in I'm a Loser. You have to listen carefully, but it's in there. And so other chords like the flat 7 chord became really big for them in 1964 and 65. They just the flat 7 chord is something that had been used before, but they found about 5 new uses for it that nobody else had combined it the same way with other harmonies. So, yeah, that's one of the really fascinating things about their ears. They would find something new that nobody else had done before, and they wouldn't know what to call it necessarily, but their ears would hold on to them, and the same relationships would come out or would have a new twist the next time they did them.
When you say no one else had done before, are you even including, say, pre-rock and roll standards, for example?
Sure. I mean, folk music and blues, and there's many examples of that flat 7 chord I just mentioned. And it would have been used, or in Bo Diddley, and Buddy Holly might have used it too. That flat 7 chord would have just been a neighbor to the 1 chord. Your 1 chord is your home base, your tonal center to which all the other chords eventually lead. And if you go from 1 to a flat 7 and back to 1, it has a bluesy quality. But the Beatles didn't stop there. They would use the flat 7 chord to go to 4, or the flat 7 chord to go to 5, or something else equally unusual. And those relationships, once the Beatles had done them, they took over. Now, I have to say the flat 7 to 4 is actually something that the Four Tops used first, but just, weeks before the Beatles did. So it's hard to know. It was something in the air, that's for sure.
Wow. Tell me something about, I saw her standing there. It starts with a 7th chord. Mm-hmm. I think it's the E7th.
That's
Was
right.
that commonly done? Because I know Paul has talked about how the bass line in that song was influenced by Chuck Berry's I'm Talking About You. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm Talking About You starts with the 7th chord.
That's right. Chuck Berry used that, what we call the tonic 7, the 1-7 chord, quite a bit in his guitar playing. So it probably came from Chuck Berry as well, that 7th chord on the tonic. The fun thing about that E7 chord is the Beatles play it all different kinds of places. Sometimes if you watch Lennon in concert playing I Saw Her Standing There, he's playing that up on the 5th fret with, what you would call a C7 hand formation up on the 5th fret, and it sounds like an E7 chord. And he plays at different places, just depending on his mood, I guess. But you get slightly different voicings of that chord all over the guitar. The Beatles, especially Lennon as a rhythm guitarist, he knew that instrument inside out. He doesn't get half the credit he deserves as a guitarist.
Well, what does it do when you start a song with the 7th chord? Because most songs start with a major or a minor, right?
Yeah, it's really exciting because you're not sure what's going on. Usually, if you hear an extended chord played for several bars, say maybe 16 beats or so, that would be 4 bars in that song, you think, oh, that's the tonic chord, but why has it got that that seventh in there that's tugging, and it's totally a blues thing. It's R&B, but the Coasters would sing phrases that would end on the lowered 7th scale degree, which is that seventh in that 1/7 chord. So, for instance, in Youngblood, George Harrison is singing, these phrases that end on that lowered 7th scale degree instead of resolving into the tonic harmony. So when he does the same thing years later in I Need You, there's a vocal phrase that ends exactly the same way as Youngblood does. And it relates to that thing you point out, and I saw her standing there. It opens the song with something that is exciting because it's tension that's not resolved.
Interesting. Can we talk a little bit about the Beatles' harmonies?
Yeah, sure.
And how different were their harmonies from the groups that preceded them, like, say, the Beach Boys? Well, certainly they were influenced by the Everleys, as we know.
Right.
And other great harmony groups of the time, like, the Hollies and the Byrds and, later Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Were they very different in what they did with their harmonies?
The amazing thing is how the Beatles, through their career, don't show any progression that you can follow in terms of their vocal harmonies. They'd started, like you say, with Everly Brothers very much. Their first two singles, Love Me Do is like Bye Bye Love Sideways, and Please Please Me adds some of Kathy's Clown in there in terms of the vocal arrangement. And they do a lot of two-part singing through 1963, usually with John singing the lead vocal and McCartney adding what we call a descant vocal above that, often in parallel thirds, but occasionally with fourths and fifths, and sometimes not moving in parallel motion. But then they go lots of different directions. They become more Motown influenced in 65 and 66. And so you get things like in Help, Lennon is singing the lead, but you hear Paul and George predicting the words he's going to sing, right? They come in and sing before Lennon does, and it's just like the vocal arrangement of Please Mr. Postman. If you listen to the lead singer versus the backing singers there, it's the same relationship that you get in Help. So they keep picking up from all sorts of popular music. It's hard to know if the Beach Boys, if there's a specific example from the Beach Boys, but I'll tell you, the vocal parts in Drive My Car are so dissonant that if you could hear just the vocal parts alone, it probably would remind you of the kind of sound the Beach Boys got from the Four Freshmen, that the close harmony with real dissonances, dissonance treatment, and chromatic relationships. And, of course, a lot of Rubber Soul and Revolver are very closely modeled on Detroit and Memphis, Motown and Stax, and the vocals are right in there. But then you get things like Good Day Sunshine and Paperback Writer, where they start to explore the polyphonic relationships. In other words, not singing the same words and the same rhythm, but sort of answering each other, or having one line echo another line. Very unusual, and it's hard to think of pop forebears for that. I don't know, can any of you guys think of anything like Paperback Writer, the chorus, or Good Day Sunshine that came before that? They really seem like kind of original experiments to me.
All right. I always like to point to Yes It Is, because I think that song, doesn't it have a lot of dissonance in it?
Oh, yes. It's wonderful. It's, Lennon disparaged that song. I think he just called it some kind of a retread of This Boy. But, it's beautiful vocal harmony. Absolutely. And plays with dissonance. And This Boy does as well. I think that's the song that William Mann mentioned, dare I say it, pandiatonic clusters.
Right.
Was the vocal parts of This Boy. And it's the same thing going on in Yes It Is. And yeah, beautiful, beautiful treatment.
Yeah. Could you talk just a little bit about dissonance for anyone that may not know what it is?
Sure. It's something the Beatles really learned how to control for themselves in late 1965. And it's rampant on the Rubber Soul album. So there are certain relationships in what we call vertical sonorities. That means tones that are heard at the same time. And the distance between the tones are measured. The distances are measured by what we call intervals. So we can measure an interval as a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth or sixth and so on, as how far apart the two voices are at any given time. And certain intervals are always consonant when measured against the bass. Certain intervals are always dissonant, and some intervals, it depends on the context. And the Beatles really learned the context. Actually, it goes back to mid-65 with the song Wait. The song Wait, if you hear, George plays those two volume control pedal chords all by themselves just before a verse comes in. Yup. It's hard to sing just one part because he plays 2 or 3 pitches at the same time. But that is what we call a 4/3 suspension. He resolves a dissonant fourth to a consonant third over the same chord. And that same sound affects We Can Work It Out, in What Goes On, and in I'm Looking Through You. They all have that same dissonance. And sometimes they add the sixth resolving to a fifth above that fourth resolving to a third. To what they didn't know is they were writing a cadential 6/4, which is something I wish my freshmen could learn to do as easy to.
I think, if people are still confused about that, if they want to think of a 4/3 suspension and what it is, if you think of the chords that begin Pinball Wizard.
Yes.
That's a 4/3, right?
That's right. And there, Pete Townsend is definitely, thinking about Italian opera, because the bass line moves down from the 1 chord to the 5 chord, just like it would have in Renaissance era or early Baroque opera, where the 4/3 suspension was rampant. Mm-hmm. So we got to give Townsend some credit there. I think he actually, whether he knew it was a 4/3 suspension or not, he had the sound right. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to bounce around, and so we can all have equal time here. So let me pass you over to Steve.
Thank you, Ken. Hello, Walter. Your discussion there got me going. You talked about Wait as having those intricate chords. What would you call the earliest song that shows that they were just not another pop band?
Wow. Yeah, that's. I think, Please Please Me shows me a lot of originality. There's just so many sparkling things through early 1963 that, totally legitimizes their popularity far and above any other band that had come before. And it's everything. Ringo, although I think George Martin kind of represses Ringo in the studio. If you listen to what Ringo does live on the BBC or in those Hamburg tapes from the end of '62, he is just rocking out, and I think it's all George Martin can do to, tone down the cymbals and the snare in 1963. And then I think he lets Ringo have his way in the studio by late '63. But even in Ringo's work, you can see this incredible energy and a feel for what the song means. And he just develops that beautifully, even though, McCartney may say, we told Ringo everything to play, what part of the cymbal to play on, and this and that. It all comes out as Ringo's personality, just completely. And they all grow incredibly like that. They were always listening for the new thing. They were saying back in early '63, wouldn't it be great if there was a guitar that sounded like an organ? or there was an organ that sounded like a guitar. And then so by the end of 63, when I Want to Hold Your Hand came out, as recently as maybe 10, 15 years ago, there were still people thinking that was an organ on that track. And it was just, Lennon's guitar plugged into a limiter that was, compressing the hell out of the signal. So, even in 1963, they were looking to change their sound, get new sounds. And, their lyrics didn't go many new places in 63, except, of course, with exceptions like There's a Place. Lennon is exploring, his inner soul, but, that was not particularly unheard of in pop music. It's the same kind of thing Brian Wilson did in My Room, which was from about that time, maybe a little later. So, I wouldn't point to the lyrics in 1963, but in terms of melodic shape, their deft use of different scales, both major and minor, and modal scales and chromatic pitches, different harmonies, lots of interesting things going on rhythmically. And with the form of songs, every song had its own relationship between verses and choruses, and the phrases would be of different lengths. And so I guess I would just say in general, there's lots of things bubbling in 1963, but I don't think it's till 64 that they put aside their success formulas that really culminate in I Want to Hold Your Hand, and they say, okay, we're going after America, Can't Buy Me Love, we're going for a new sound, it's going to be blues. And they consciously drop everything that had made them so popular, which is something that happened throughout their career, right? They were constantly reinventing themselves consciously.
Oh, yeah.
And I think in 64, the first time they decide we're going to, shed our Beatles skin and become something new, I think it's in early 64 that they really show their artists. And then of course, they, every song on A Hard Day's Night is their, brand new composition. And they come in and record 3 or 4 new songs in one February day. It's just phenomenal, the imagination at work.
Authors, there's been a series of books that have argued that either Rubber Soul, Revolver, or Sgt. Pepper were the Beatles' biggest advancement musically. Which one of those albums do you think qualifies for that?
Yeah, well, each in their own way is, and I would say, it depends on what factor you're thinking about, but Revolver is definitely a step beyond everything that was going on in rock music, and Pepper was as well. Rubber Soul is, a big step from where they had been. I just had a student a couple of days ago tell me, I just heard the song Girl for the first time. And that is a really strange song. And I had to agree. It's nothing like anything the Beatles had done before. So in Rubber Soul, there's just so many new things. But I think the reason those albums are singled out as great strides from where the Beatles had been is, certainly each album has its own reasons. But it also this was the time when the album was coming to the fore in terms of what listeners were buying. They were listening to the hits on the radio, but still the top albums in 64 were probably soundtracks and original cast records, right? Other than the Beatles. And maybe the Beach Boys had a big album, but albums were not big. Right. Most people didn't buy Supreme's albums or Temptations albums. But by late 65, of course, Dylan had made the album really, the thing that the really in-tune listener, the caring listener, was going to focus on. And so Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper got swept up in people just suddenly turning their allegiance from hit singles to full-length albums. And I think they benefit the Beatles benefit from that as much as the world benefits from those albums.
Mm-hmm. In terms of a particular song, if I was to talk to you about a song, it would be "And Your Bird Can Sing." I think that is just one of the most stunning songs they've done. I every time I hear that, my mouth just drops. I love that song to death.
Yeah.
What would you have to say about that?
Oh, well, "And Your Bird Can Sing" is great. I actually hear that as a progression from The Word in Rubber Soul. Mm-hmm. And that I think Lennon is trying to paint an anti-materialistic sermon, where The Word did. And, there are references to Karina Karina, right? The Dylan version of the old Lead Belly version of an old blues song, Karina Karina,
right.
Which is, I got a bird that whistles, I got a bird that sings, but I don't got Karina, and life don't mean a thing. And I think that's where the title comes from, although isn't there a mention of, is it Elvis, or who is it that song's supposedly a reference to? Well, anyway.
I always thought it was a woman, actually, but...
Right. But I think it's Lennon. You can also hear a little bit of Messiah complex going there, because the big word in that song is me. You tell me you've got everything you want and your bird can sing, but you can't get me, you can't get, and then all the Beatles come in screaming me, and so me is at the center of it. And then at the end of the bridge, Lennon is singing, look in my direction. He's sort of pointing himself out as the leader. And this is all unconscious, I'm sure. But I think where he's trying to lead his listeners is to give up the material and pick up on the spiritual or the inner life. You got your bird, and your bird is green. There are passages from the... what am I trying to think of? The Tao Te Ching, or what is it that George Harrison studied so much? The ancient Chinese proverbs and poetry. Mm-hmm. There's one saying in there that actually Sam Phillips made into a song called Five Colors, and it's all about how the colors of the world distract you from what is real, what is within. And so when, Lennon is singing, you've got all these materialistic things, and you could talk about the colors and everything that you see around you, but you don't really get what's important. And that would be the word. That would be, Lennon singing me, look in my direction, and I'll lead you to where you're going. So anyway, that's my take on that song, but I love the harmony. I love the bridge, that chromatic descent under the B minor chord, where he's just hammering away the vocal B, 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 and he changes the chord all over the place. Mm-hmm. All kinds of ways that B is consonant with chords or dissonant with chords. He draws everything out of that he can, just like She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah is set to 3 different harmonies, or Help is set to 3 different harmonies. It's sort of like that with his singing that pitch B over and over and over in the bridge, to all the different chords changing underneath. Mm-hmm. And also you can compare like Lennon's strumming. Lennon has the most dead strumming on earth in that song. Just that E chord over and over, 1 chord per beat, whereas the trio of the 2 casinos and the bass are just flabbergasting in their beauty. Well, it's Lennon is saying, look, just get your mind off all that flashy guitar stuff that George and Paul are doing. Just focus on this ohm, this unchanging chord underneath. So I don't know, those are the kinds of things that come to mind when I think of that song, which I love dearly. It's great, yeah.
And as a my last question, as a musicologist, what is your favorite bootleg?
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh, there are so many great ones. I still remember the first two I bought, Yellow Matter Custard, and
Same here.
And one that was called Alpha Omega was some of the Get Back stuff. And I just, I'll never forget the first time I heard that, because I knew it was the Beatles, but I'd never heard any of those songs before, and it was so cool. When the Yellow Dog stuff started coming out in the early 90s, was it late 80s? I just thought that was phenomenal. Just incredible. Those are still some of my favorites. In fact, I played about 5 of the first 9 takes of Help for my class the other day, so they could hear how George couldn't play his big riff in the song during the basic track, and he didn't want to do it during the vocals. And the discussion they had over that was, great. And it's in those bootlegs that you really feel you're, a fly on the wall in the studio.
Alan, back to you.
Okay, you mentioned early that before the Ed Sullivan Show, you had a couple of years of piano lessons. I mean, you're obviously also a guitarist, and there is so much attention in the book to what parts of the drum kit Ringo is using. What all do you play?
Oh, well, I do play a little guitar, but just enough to really to demonstrate to my students. And I put a bunch of videos together that I play guitar and bass on those. I don't play drums. I've got a son who takes care of that, and I love hearing him play. I just love hearing him play. I've played piano forever, and so I never liked practicing. So I was a piano major as an undergraduate, but boy, my students today would never believe that. Because the conservatory level of training that students have today, it just would put my piddly skills to shame. But I do play a lot of piano, and that's my go-to instrument, really.
Okay. When I was in music school, I had a music history teacher named Abraham Vinus. He wrote a couple of books you might have seen, but he used to. The
name is familiar.
Yeah, he used to, when he would demonstrate something, he would go to the piano, and it would be a little bit rough, and he would turn to the class and say, "I don't apologize for my piano playing. I'm a cellist."
That's right. That's great.
Another thing that you mentioned in passing was Bo Diddley and the influence that he had. And I think another one of the great things about the Beatles is that when they were influenced by something and used it, they would disguise it so incredibly. And the Bo Diddley thing I'm thinking of is the chord progression of Tomorrow Never Knows, which is basically one chord, but they go down to the,
Of course. And believe it or not, Alan, try this. If you take the melody in the song Bo Diddley, it's the same melody, the same vocal arpeggiation in Tomorrow Never Knows, slowed down incredibly. But isn't that the song about Bo Diddley buy you a diamond ring, and if that diamond ring don't shine, right? Isn't that the song? Isn't that the one that's called Bo Diddley?
Yeah.
That's all the same vocal pitches as in Tomorrow Never Knows. And you're right, the underlying harmony in Tomorrow Never Knows is 1 to flat 7 to 1, all over an unchanging first scale degree in the bass. Yeah.
And yet, listening to Tomorrow Never Knows, probably the last thing you would think of is Bo Diddley,
Miles away, yeah.
That's amazing. I never thought of that before.
Yeah. I thought I'd actually also ask you. It's I think a pretty bizarrely simple answer, but everybody always talks about this as if it's a big mystery. So perhaps you could explain to our readers what an Aeolian cadence is.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, it's not a straightforward thing. There's a couple of different possibilities, but my take on it is the cadence in P.S. I Love You, really. This is what I called it, the Aeolian cadence, where you have what would sound like the 6 chord to the 7 chord to the 1 chord in the Aeolian mode. The Aeolian mode is the same thing as the natural minor. In other words, it's like the minor scale, except you never have a leading tone. You never raise the 7th scale degree. You always have the lowered 7th scale degree. So in P.S. I Love You, in the ending, you, it's 1, flat 7, flat 6, flat 7, 1. And I call that the Aeolian cadence because it sounds like the Aeolian mode there. But I think what William Mann was referring to was in
Not a second time.
All I Gotta Do, maybe?
I thought it was Not a Second Time.
Yeah.
Not a second time. Yeah. Not a second time, which ends alternating a 1 chord with a 6 chord, a 1 chord with a 6 chord, which is alternating a major 1 chord with a minor 6 chord, and back and forth there, which is, something John Lennon loved Arthur Alexander for, and Lennon loved that progression, 1 to 6, 1 to 6. And I think that's what William Mann is talking about, because that's what you get at the end of the Mahler piece he refers to. Is it
Das Lied von der Erde?
Das Lied von der Erde, right.
Yeah.
That ends with that, what he calls an Aeolian cadence. And I think that's what happens at the end of Not a Second Time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So will the following volumes of this series take up the solo works, Walter?
I have chapters drafted on Lennon and Harrison. Of course, McCartney is, so active and so prolific. I dread the idea of trying to write that chapter. But actually,
I'll help you.
It might be necessary, right? I mean, what a bunch of solo work to follow the breakup of the Beatles. But Tim Riley and I have been writing a textbook on the Beatles that may be out the end of this year, maybe in time for the White Album celebration. That's the most recent Beatle project.
I see. Oh.
Yeah.
What's it called?
It's called What Goes On, The Beatles, Their Music, and Their Time, because it's aimed for non-musicians, and so we're going to cover as much about the culture and social things going on as the Beatles were growing up, and how their music and their work interacted with the world around them. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a good title. Mm-hmm. Maybe not the Beatles' most popular song, but it fits.
Okay. What was your feeling about Paul's classical stuff?
Yeah, Paul's a dabbler. He loves to put his fingers into everything, and there's some real cringeworthy moments, I have to say. Mm-hmm. But there's some things in the oratorio that are really glorious, I think.
I thought so.
Some of it's really, kind of silly, but my gosh, some of it's really beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't say I've listened to Standing Stone a lot, but I suspect there's some good stuff in there, too. Mm-hmm. Can I ask Alan what he thinks?
All right. I like the oratorio a lot. I thought basically that, we're talking about extended song forms, and if there's one thing the guy can do, it's a song form. But I also thought there was an extended violin solo in there that made me think that this guy could probably write a concerto.
That's right.
And he actually has been. I don't know whatever happened to it, but as of 2007, he was working on a guitar concerto, and it never saw the light of day.
He was working with that guitarist Carlos
Bonell.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I never heard much about that project.
Yeah, it's a pity. Maybe we will eventually. Standing Stone, I wasn't that crazy about. Because, talk about his fear of plagiarizing existing works. It was sort of like, okay, well, now we're going to have a scene with a boat on the water, and suddenly sounds like Debussy, and now we're going to have a battle scene, and it's Shostakovich or Prokofiev, and so there was a little bit of paint by number in there, I think. Yeah.
But you don't think that Paul is familiar with those works, do you?
I think he is. No question.
I think he's mentioned. I think he's mentioned Debussy before. Yeah.
You know, he would listen voraciously, and George Martin would talk about how much Strawberry Fields reminds him of Debussy. Well, can't you just imagine McCartney wanting to hear what Debussy sounds like? I wouldn't be surprised if he knows Shostakovich and Debussy.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. And you know what? When I used to spend my evenings at places like Carnegie Hall, I got to know some of the ushers, and one of them was saying, "Hey, Paul McCartney's here the other night, and he just went to classical concerts, and probably nobody bothered him, know. And as you know, I mean, in '66, early '66, when they were not making a new movie, he was off seeing Luciano Berio and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen performances. So I think he probably does know a lot about classical music, and the Debussy, because of, I guess, La Mer and stuff like that. If he wants to write a scene about the ocean, he's going to think about that kind of sound, not necessarily say, I'm going to steal some from Debussy, but that's the sound he associates with classical music doing water.
Yeah.
So,
since you guys brought up classical music, I was actually gonna, and I didn't ask about Lennon and McCartney as classical composers. And Alan, this would be probably something that you'd want to comment on too. I mean, they're they've always been compared to classical, the great classical composers. Walter, how do they fit in as far as you're concerned? Alan, you can go in on that one too.
Yeah, well, I used to hear all the time, back when I was starting my career and wanting desperately to do research on the Beatles as a student, and was told, no, you can't do that. And, I was constantly hearing, well, they're just not in the same league as Wagner or Mozart or Brahms. But, if you listen to a Schubert song or a Brahms song or a Mozart aria, you are getting very close to the Beatles' strengths. And they absolutely belong in that same group. They never set out to be classical musicians. They didn't set out to write for classical instruments or to study counterpoint and harmony and the forms of music. They wanted to be, Carole King. They wanted to be Rodgers and Hammerstein. And so there's a charming moment at the end of one of those Ed Sullivan shows, remember, where Ed says, now, boys, he's got the Beatles right there with him, and he says, I want you to know that we just got a telegram from Richard Rodgers, and he congratulates you. And George is looking at John and Paul like, see, that's just what you wanted. And, it's a wonderful little moment there. They wouldn't have gotten a telegram from Milton Babbitt, I'm sure.
But they could have gotten one from Leonard Bernstein. Yeah, I mean, he from the very beginning was pretty supportive, and towards the end of his life, he said that they were the Schuberts of our time. So
he did all those young people's concerts with, he did that Young People's Concert Series program, talking about Lennon and McCartney. It's still out there. I think you can buy it on DVD now. But
Right. He was the real champion of the Beatles. A number of classical composers. Ned Gorham, a songwriter, spoke about the Beatles a good bit.
Yeah. Just the mere fact that there are so many classical arrangements of Beatles songs tells you something, how well the music adapts to that.
That's right. Some of those things are wonderful, too. Some of them are really clever.
So Ken and Steve have a couple more questions?
Oh, yeah. I think we're going to have to invite you on another time because there's way
when the
too
new
many.
book comes out.
Yeah, for sure.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Even before that. Something I mentioned on this show a while back, I don't remember when, but I thought that it was really unique when the Beatles would take a certain song that they had on an album, and it would reappear later. Like, for example, You Never Give Me Your Money, which would then be inserted into Carry That Weight.
Right.
And that's something that I kind of associate more with soundtracks to films and theater,
right.
scores and everything.
The idea
Was that
is in a stage show, sure. Mm-hmm.
right? Is that something that was done at all with pop groups prior to the Beatles?
I don't think so. If anybody did, I would look at the Moody Blues, but nothing comes to mind. But that was although it does remind you of like a Broadway show with a reprise of an earlier song coming up at the end.
Right.
It also happens in opera, and I think McCartney said that he was working with George Martin to try to bring some form into the thing. I think were his words for why the You Never Give Me Your Money would come back the way it does. It's like a great return, isn't it?
It's very effective.
In Microcosm, something was just pointed out to me the other day that had never occurred to me. In Nowhere Man, it's the first verse that comes back at the end. Usually the last verse is a repetition of the third or fourth verse, but in Nowhere Man, it's the first verse that comes back. And the first time you get that verse, it starts a cappella, just the voices, right? Mm-hmm. But in the last hearing of it, it sounds like an arrival that points out that, here is a composer, John Lennon, who knew where he was all the time, but now we got to bring it home to him at the end of the song. Hard to put your finger on it, but that's the effect that has for me. And there aren't that many songs that do that really return to the beginning for their ending in that way.
Right. I also wanted to bring up I'll Be Back, because I think that's a very unusual composition in the sense that it has so many different sections in it.
Exactly.
And it still comes back to the very beginning. So, I mean, usually you have a verse chorus going back to the verse, but there's more to it than that. And it's all done in 2 minutes and 20 seconds, you know?
Yeah. Isn't that phenomenal? Yeah, that's a remarkable song. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Steve was mentioning before, if you could point out a song where it was like the first example to you where they were not just a pop band. You could point to so many examples, but if you go back as early as, say, Ask Me Why,
sure.
I think how unusual a song was that, because there's even a bit of a Latin feel in there, although they were doing Besame Mucho at the same time. But I thought that was very different in terms of as a composition.
Right. I'm so glad you point that out, because we actually, I'm teaching a Beatles class this semester, and we had a long discussion on the structure of that song that made me go back and rethink it from the start that night. And I came back in and gave the students a handout on my, take on how that song was put together. But yeah, if you think about it in terms of verses, choruses, bridges, refrains, it's a very unusual construction. And, in a way, it's sort of like some of the songs like Dreamers Do, that have unusual things about the form, and you just get the sense that they don't quite have control of it yet. And it's a little bit like that in Ask Me Why. It's like it's not under control, but it is so. I mean, it's like any composer. If that was the best song they wrote, you should be proud,
Yeah, because we always point to when George Martin would very often say, the first time that he met them, the best song they can come up with was Love Me Do. And I what was wrong with Ask Me Why? What was wrong with P.S. I Love You? I just don't get it. But I think they were very unique for its time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm glad you think so, because Ask Me Why definitely outshines Love Me Do as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Steve.
In talking about songs that were out of control, I mean, and the one that comes to my mind is If You Got Trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean that really in terms of, it's not particularly a favorite of mine in terms of Lennon and McCartney songs, but there's one that I think fits that description perfectly, don't you, Walter?
Yeah, it was a song that the Beatles couldn't get a handle on. Mm-hmm. And it was almost like once they heard Ringo sing it, they thought, oh, this doesn't really have potential. Because the idea without the voice is just this droning idea that goes on. And it could have gone a number of different directions. But, Ringo made a song out of it by singing it. And I think they had similar problems around that time. The song That Means a Lot.
Right.
What a phenomenal composition, but the Beatles couldn't figure out how to arrange it. What were they going to do with it? And, can you imagine if Yesterday had gone the same way because the Beatles couldn't figure out what to do with Yesterday?
Right.
It's like their ideas were pushing further than their skills in some ways, that they had to catch up with their ideas, and sometimes they couldn't always do it. But thankfully, George Martin was there to say, oh, try this. And boy, that made the difference a lot.
And they gave That Means a Lot to P.J. Proby, who actually did a halfway decent job with it.
Yeah, I think so. Uh-huh.
So, yeah, anyway.
It could have been a James Bond song, huh?
Yeah.
Could have been.
Alan?
Okay, so, Will, that was a fun discussion, and I think, substantial in a way that we don't often get into. And thank you so much for coming, Walter.
Yeah, my pleasure, absolutely.
And we should talk to you again when the new book comes out, if not before.
Good idea.
How do people get either in touch with you, or do you have a website? Is there something that people can look up?
I'm easy to find through the university, or you could just Google my name. But my email address is, I'm happy to give it out, is WEVERETT at UMich, that's UMICH.edu.
Okay, great. And Steve, do you want to tell people how to contact you?
BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com is my email address, and I have a Facebook page, Beatles News and Information, where I post all these crazy stories about the Beatles. You can contact the show at Things We Said Today Radio Show at gmail.com. We have a Facebook page, Things We Said Today Beatles Radio Fans. We have a Twitter address, Things We Said Fab, and we're always looking to hear from you with suggestions and comments on the shows.
Okay, great. Okay. And Ken?
My email address is everylittlething@att.net. My website is kenmichaelsradio.com. I always say be sure to check out the website for Beatles Trivia every week, where you can win 1 out of 9 prizes. And I just want to say thank you to all the listeners who have been writing to us lately. And we got a great response from the Neil Innes interview that we just did. If there are any of you that can't get enough of Neil, I just did another interview with him, which is now on my website. And we cover a lot of ground that we didn't do on this show, where the Ruddles are concerned, the Beatles, Monty Python. You can find out what 2 George Harrison videos Neil Innes was in. And the way to find out is by going to my website. And when you see on the tab More Interviews, go to the drop-down menu to Interviews page 4, and the entire interview's on there. So find out more about Neil and his career right there on my website at kenmichaelsradio.com.
Okay, so you can contact me on Facebook at either Alan Kozin or Alan Kozin Remixed. And for Steve Marinucci, Ken Michaels, and Walter Everett, this is Alan Kozin saying thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.